So now in the room, we move to a panel discussion, and I would like to invite the participants to come take a seat here at the front. And I'll just say a word about them while they are doing that. Nobuyuki Kamba helped to establish and then lead the conservation department at the Tokyo National Museum from 1998 to 2015. The English translation of one of his books, Conservation Practice in Museums for Researchers and Museum Professionals, was published just this spring. And Melissa Rinne is Senior Specialist in the Department of Research and International Collaboration in the Curatorial Division of the Kyoto National Museum. And her recent publications include Foreign Textile Collectors in Taisho Period Kyoto, a guest book from the shop of Nomura Shojiro, and Jofu, a bast fiber textile imitating silk. So I think the ending of the last session with the question about the idea of institutions accruing merit by acting on objects as once traditional actors did is a natural link to this panel, which is devoted to conservation in the institution of the museums. Conservation departments are rare in Japanese museums, as you heard. Nobuyuki created the first one at the Tokyo National Museum, and Melissa, your museum in Kyoto was the first to have a large on-site conservation center. And yet, as new and rare, as we've heard, as it is to have conservation departments in museums, Japan as a country has one of the strongest cultural heritage legislations, programs, and conservation practices are deeply part of museum life. And we're going to talk about some of the tensions this creates. So let's begin with the topic of display and how objects are displayed in museums, and perhaps with some nod towards the difference between museums in Japan and the United States, and display in private collections as well as in museums. So Melissa, will you tell us a little bit about display in the context of private ownership?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. It's a real honor to be here today, and especially to be able to speak with Dr. Kamba, who is a pioneer in this field of conservation science in the national museums in Japan. I am not a conservator, but I have worked in museums in the United States. He's in the national museums, and I've worked in the not in museums in the United States and Japan for 25 years, plus or minus. So I've seen the different sort of systems in play. And one of the biggest differences is indeed this display, the number of rotations that happen. In the Kyoto National Museum, where I'm working now, the paintings are rotated every month, every 4 weeks, and the other objects, textiles, lacquer, metalwork, are rotated every 6 weeks generally. And for special exhibitions, which we generally have twice or 3 times a year, these are, unlike the United States where they're usually 3 months long or more, they're typically 6 weeks or so, sometimes 4 and occasionally 8, but 6 is a sort of standard length. And even within that, there's always a big rotation in the center for all the light sensitive work and sometimes non-light sensitive works. But in addition, there are also smaller rotations. So some works go on view for only maybe 2 weeks, and sometimes even 1 week for very important objects. So obviously this creates a huge work, an amount of work for the curators and the people installing. And this is in the United States, it's very different. The museum I worked at had rotations of the permanent collection that were generally 6 months. Sometimes it may have expanded now to 8 months, I'm not sure. But that's, I think, pretty typical of museums here. Sometimes there'll be shorter rotations for more light sensitive objects, such as prints or textiles. This is a very different thing. And I think this tradition of, or this practice of rotating, so, being much more, it's very much more agile in Japan in a certain way. But this comes from this older tradition of bringing works out for just brief periods of time in many cases. Obviously, sculptures in temples, and there are objects, certain types of objects that stay out, long term. But many of the paintings, and especially the objects that have that are light sensitive, have survived for hundreds of years, have been brought out only briefly throughout their long existence. This is something that Professor Lippitt has, come up with a very nice term for this called occasional use, which I quite like because the word occasional is, from time to time, only sparse intervals, but also because it's brought out for occasions, particular occasions. For example, particular events that are, anniversary type events that happen, or particular seasons, or particular guests. So objects will be brought out for occasions. I think I'm trying to think of a Western analogy, but it's could be like holiday decorations that come out only for a very brief time and then are put away, or maybe like some things are made only for one event. For example, the museum I work at now, the Kyoto National Museum, had an exhibition in 2018 called Hidden Treasures from a Merchant's Storehouse. And for this exhibition, this was an old merchant family from Osaka, and objects from their storehouses were brought out. And among them were like 30 full sets of lacquered trays with all of the dishes that belong to them for each individual type of food. And these were made simply for one anniversary event within the family. I think it was like the 30th anniversary. I can't remember exactly what it was for, but one time these were used. So they were custom ordered objects that you were used only once, and then they were put into the storehouse and left there for the next 150 years or 100 years. So that's a kind of, the objects that we're seeing have not been displayed very frequently. And I think that's that tradition has lived on in the museums.
Thank you, Peter, introducing me. And today, from the standpoint of view of a conservation scientist, I would like to talk about the characteristics of Japanese thinking through the relationship between the tradition in conservation and how it is being used now. There are many topics in the limited time. So please allow me to participate in the discussion in Japanese to save time and to make discussion clear. Is that right? Yeah. So I'd like to start.現在の、東京国立博物館、私はもうすでにリタイアしているので、全く現在のことは分かりませんけれども、私が関わってきた中でお話ししますと、2020年、つい先だってですけども、段階でですね、博物館1年間で展示されたオブジェクトの数は1万点ございますけれども、そのうちの半分5000点が展示会によって、展示公開されているということになります。それで、先ほどメリッサさんがもおっしゃったように、例えば絵画は浮世絵は4週間、あるいは 質工芸品、漆は12週間とか、それぞれの分野で割合が決まっておりますけども、その各分野が展示会をして、2020年、400回の展示会が博物館の中でなされているという、まず現状がございます。
So, Dr. Kamba is now retired, but he wanted to talk about his experiences at the Tokyo National Museum, where he was for a very long time. If you look at the year 2020, in the Tokyo National Museum as a whole, there were 10,000 plus objects put on display. Of those, 5,000 were rotated. Each category has different rotation intervals. So woodblock prints 4 weeks, crafts 12 weeks, and so forth. But 5,000 total were rotated. That means that overall there were 400 rotation changes in the museum as a whole.
実はその2005年の段階でですね、この現在においてもその展示会の回数が非常に多いわけですけれども、その2005年、20年近く前の段階ですけれども、絵画、ハンギングスクロールとかスクリーンとかそういったものは年4週間の展示を行っておりました。一つの作品に関して。従いまして、一箇所、一つの展示ケースで絵画を展示する場合、その一つの展示ケースに年間12回の展示会が生じるわけです。で、当時、非常に当時も今もですけど、日本の美術館の職員は非常に厳しい立場に置かれていまして、まず人の量が少ない、人員が少ない、人員削減ということで人の量が少ないということで、この膨大な展示会を、日本の場合、これ特殊事情かもしれません。あるいは日本独特のシステムと言っていいと思いますが、学芸員が直接展示会に携わります。実際に手に持って学芸員が展示会をすると。そうすると学芸員、さまざまな責任を持つ中で、この展示会を、例えば絵画一つのケースで年12回を行うことは、大変なストレス、作業的なストレスがあるわけですね。
So in 2005, there were 4-week rotations for the paintings that were displayed in the Tokyo National Museum. Screens, hanging scrolls. In a single case, you would change the painting on display a total of 12 times, which was very difficult for the staff. There were too few personnel, and in Japan, curators directly handle works and oversee the rotation. So this was very stressful for the staff.
そういう事情から、ここが保存科学的な思考といいますか、そういう形で、年4週間実際に展示していたわけですけども、1.5年、1年半で6週間展示するという割合としては同じなんですね。1年あたり4週間という割合を変えることなく、1.5年で6週間展示することにすれば、展示会の回数が8回に、減少するわけです。そしてそれに伴ってハンドリングされる作品のその回数も3分の1減るということで、作品に対する影響も小さくなるということで、現在その考え方の中で展示が行われております。それでも冒頭申し上げましたように、膨大な数の展示会が存在しているということですね。
So in order to conserve the works, the interval between rotations was expanded from 4 weeks to 6 weeks. Another way of thinking of that is the overall cycle was expanded from a year to a year and a half for the display of the same types of scrolls. So in one calendar year, there were 8 rotations and works were handled less by around a third. and the less handling led to less, of course, wear and tear. Still the overwhelming hive of rotational activity in museums.
Let's turn from display to storage. Is there the same paradoxical set of issues? On the one hand, helping to preserve, on the other hand, helping to wear out the object? Or is storage in Japanese museums, from the point of view of conservation, a clearer topic?
So before going on to the issue of storage, I just would like to sort of briefly touch back on the issue, on the role of conservators in the US versus Japan. I'm just speaking the US context, but we all were very privileged yesterday to be able to look at storage at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we learned from the conservators there about the numerous rotations and the condition checking, the remedial treatments, sometimes larger conservation treatments. But each time a rotation happens in major museums in the US, as I understand it, and in the institution I worked at as well, there's a whole sort of system of various people whose permission and also whose hands this rotation list has to pass. And so conservators check, do these repairs. In Japan, there's much more responsibility with the curator themselves, and the curator is sort of solely responsible for the work of much of the registration, much of the overseeing of the conservation of their particular area of the collection, the actual handling of the artwork that, in the United States are usually professional art handlers on the staff, while in Japan, they're contractors. Same with conservators. In Japan, they're typically contractors. That's why it was so kind of revolutionary that at the Tokyo National Museum, they brought in staff conservators so that they could work on the collection before these rotations and in anticipation of future exhibitions. So I just want to point out that difference. In terms of storage, actually, I'd let Dr. Kamba speak first about museum storage in Japan, and then let me follow up.
その前に展示のことを少し付け加えておきます。そもそもその頻繁な展示替え、これは決して今に始まったことではなくて、古くからの日本の伝統に従った方式がこの現代の博物館においてもそれが息づいている、つながっているということをまず申し上げておきたいと思います。例えば、平安時代、古今和歌集という日本の文学の中にもすでに春夏秋冬という四季に応じた、歌の分類がなされている。それだけ日本の風土は、季節の変化が大きく、それに伴って生活の在り方も変えていくっていう文化がもともとありました。その四季を大切にして、その四季折々に、その秋に合う作品、冬にマッチする作品、そういう形で展示会というものが文化的生活の様式として行われてきたという背景がございます。
He wanted to add one comment about display, and that is that the museums in Japan, the national museums, Tokyo National Museum, still have embedded within them the influence of traditional forms of display in Japan. This can't be emphasized enough. It's very deep. If you look at, for example, poetic culture in Japan, it's organized according to seasonal change, and this idea of poetry as a form of cultural memory that commemorates change, the passage of time, the temporality, and what it means for lifestyles and so forth is deeply embedded in the culture of painting. So paintings participate in this expression of the passage of time, which is why they're displayed and put away so frequently within pre-modern contexts. That's continued in the museum context. So there's a cultural rationale for this incredible number of rotations that we see.
このことを保存科学的に私が説明しますとですね、どういうメリットがあるかと言いますと、日本の家屋は皆さんご存知のように木と紙が主なる材料です。したがって屋外の影響を屋内において非常に受けやすい、先ほど正倉院のご説明ありましたけれども、一般家屋はもっと華奢な木材ですから、屋外の影響を受けやすい。つい先だって私はマダム・バタフライの、オペラを拝見しましたけども、日本の空間の仕切りは紙でできた障子というスクリーンで全て空間を仕切る、そういう演出になってました。まさにそういう屋外の影響を受けやすい、環境である。それが日本の建物の中なんです。そうすると、そこで展示される期間が短い、披露される時間が短いということは、移ろいやすい環境の影響を短く最小化することができるっていう、展示外の意味っていうのはそういうところに現れてくると思いますね。
So from the perspective of Dr. Kamba and his scientific status as a scientific conservator, it's important to think about the environments in which these works are conserved. So Japanese houses are often made of basically constructed of some form of wood or paper for the most part, and so they're vulnerable to climatic conditions, external environmental influences, and for example, screens being used to partition spaces in the interior and so forth. And so the goal is to minimize the influence of the change in the environments and microenvironments in which art is stored. And that's closely related to the question of frequent rotations.
ここで収蔵の話にやっと移れるわけなんですけれども、短い展示ということは長期に及ぶ収蔵という組み合わせになります。したがって展示場で、展示する期間を短くする、つまり展示場での気候変化からのマイクロクライメットの変化からの影響を小さくしても、収蔵この中での影響が大きければ全く意味をなさないわけですね。でそこで、これは幸男さんが先ほど、冒頭に、ご発表なさったように、日本の文化の、根源としてその正倉院における収蔵方式というものが、その奈良時代以降、まさに今日まで面々と受け継がれております。それはどういうことかといいますと、木材を使った収蔵方法ということで、現在、奈良時代には電気はなかったわけですね。その電気がなかった、あるいはつい最近まで電気はなかったわけですけども、そういう中で安定した環境を作るっていうことになりますと、木材が天然に持っている能力、それが湿度を安定化させる、そういう能力を持っているわけです。これをパッシブコントロールというんですけども、それによって、その能力を使って、収蔵庫の天井、壁、床を木材にし、なおかつキャビネットも木材にし、そして保存箱というものも木材にし、そういう木材を フル活用することによって安定した環境、長期に及ぶ収蔵を保障するために安定した環境というものを作り上げる、知恵がずっとこう電気のない時代から今日電気のある時代においてもそのパッシブコントロールを有効に使うという、伝統があるわけです。
With regard to the question of storage, the goal would be to keep the change of environmental factors, which can be so dramatic in the Japanese environment, to a minimum, whether it's the microenvironment of the display or the microenvironment of the storage unit. So as the Shosoin example shows, what's happened in Japan since ancient times is to activate the ability of wood to minimize the influence of changes from the outside world to the microenvironment. So wood can absorb and release moisture when necessary to keep as stable a humidity environment as possible. So if you look at storage facilities in the present, as much effort is made as possible to make the storehouses out of wood, ceiling, walls, floor, also even the storage boxes. Wood is all important, even in the era of electricity. Sometimes this is called passive control, but it's basically a kind of knowledge that has been transmitted for a long time.
Just in terms of this traditional type of storage, I think all of you know, but I'll just repeat for those who might not, that typically in older homes or in temples, there are storehouses called kura, and these have very thick mud and plaster walls, which are very absorbent of humidity, and they also have ventilation, often raised. So they're within that kura, this storehouse, you typically have, as Dr. Kamba mentioned, the wooden walls, and you will, when you go into a kura, it's a lot of wooden shelves with lots of wooden boxes on them. And as he mentioned, objects being out inside a house or a temple are at risk while they're out. They're at risk of light. There's often, natural light flowing in. There's wind. When you hang something in a tokonoma, in an alcove, it sometimes bangs against the wall and when the wind comes in. So even non-light sensitive objects, when they're brought out, are at risk of earthquakes or fires or things like that. And these kura are typically quite fireproof. They have natural, when there's a large fire, things that are in the kura are often at much less risk than the other wooden structures around them. So that's just very basic information. But there is a big difference between, what the kura look like, or excuse me, what the museum storage looks like, and we also call that the kura. What we call that in Japan, what would it looks like in Japan and in the United States institutions that I have seen, and that is in Japan, again, typically museum storage will often try as much as possible to imitate these past practices, and that you will see walls paneled in wood. You will see shelves made of wood, cabinets made of wood inside, the newest museum storage. While in the United States, the state-of-the-art storage is typically metal cabinets where you can put some sort of art sorber silica and things like that for humidity control inside the case, I think. But very different sort of concept in the construction of these. And I actually have a question I'd like to ask Dr. Kamba about wood, because of course there's always the issue of off-gassing with wood as a natural material. And I'm very curious about how in the Japanese context that off-gassing issue is addressed.
そうですね、その点については日本人が収蔵庫の中において作品のすぐそばに天然の木材を使うということについては昔というか現代においてその欧米から疑問の声を聞くことはよくございます。確かに単純に木材といえばそこには木材は化学的な成分を十分に含んでいます。 具体的に申せば酸性物質とかアルデヒドといった物質を含んでますから、その物質が大量に含まれたまま収蔵庫に持ち込めば、当然多くの文化財に致命的なダメージを与えるのは当然です。しかしながら、ここは文化的な背景ということでしかなかなか申し上げられないんですけれども、日本人は先ほど来申し上げてますように、木材をその奈良以前からでしょうね、奈良から現代まで木材というものに慣れ親しんでいる国民性があって、その木材の使い方については十分に気をつけている部分があります。それ具体的に申すと、からし、シーズニング、長い時間をかけて木材の表面に存在するそういったVOC 的な物質を放散させてしまい、安定した木材にした上で収蔵スペースに持ち込む。このことによって、VOC による文化財への影響は、小さくなっていると、そういう使い方をしているゆえに、安全であるというふうに私たちは考えています。
Undoubtedly, the question of off-gassing of wood is an important issue. Natural wood in close proximity to artworks can damage them, and there is a tradition of conservators from the West raising doubts about these storage circumstances. Wood has all kinds of materials. It off-gasses all kinds of materials, acidic and otherwise. One reason why it's used so extensively in Japan is simply cultural. It's very familiar kind of storage material for centuries. But there's also, there are cultural practices such as the seasoning of the surface of the wood that is brought into use in the storage and so forth, that is also cultural. And so it's been there's a very careful use of the material here.
Is it okay? Just one more thing. Yeah, I think one other thing that we should talk about before we move ahead is also just the very important role of boxes for storing artworks. Obviously, as I mentioned, you go into a kura, even of a temple or a house, a wealthy household. It's just, you see just mounds, tons of boxes everywhere. And the boxes, I didn't fully understand their use originally. In fact, in the United States, as those of you who work in museums know, earlier on, I don't think this exists today, but early in previous generations, it was the tradition to remove objects from their boxes as soon when they were brought back from Japan. So the institution I worked in, which was founded in 1967, I think, when the earlier generations of museum staff removed the boxes, saved the boxes in a separate place. Some of them have been restored, but a lot of them have sort of disappeared. And the reason for that is because I think this is also really cultural. It's in a Western household, for example, you go in and almost everything is out to see. Things are on display for viewing, while in Japan you go out and only one thing, or two things. A very few number of things have been selected for that particular, season, occasion, guest, time of year, etc. In boxes, boxes, and in the museum context in the West, the removal of boxes allowed visitors, like researchers, to go into the storage and see everything that the museum had. And so this was made, I think, essentially a matter of convenience, not thinking about the essential role the boxes have in, first of all, sort of documenting the object. What is it? Who made it? When was it made? Who has owned it in the past, its provenance. There's all kinds of very often important, obviously, material written on the boxes that tell us about its provenance. But additionally, boxes create sort of a microclimate, as I understand, so that if there is, I mean, museum storage is supposed to be, perfectly stable all the time. But what if you have a power outage and the generators don't work, or what happens in an emergency where everything, goes awry, all the carefully laid plans go awry? If you have a box around an object, then it is able to retain its climate for longer. It gives a buffer to the natural forces that are happening around it. And also, earthquakes. If there's an earthquake and things are in boxes and tied up, they're much more protected than they are without that. In San Francisco, where I was working before, because it's in an area that does have earthquakes, even though objects were out of their boxes, they're sandbagged very carefully so that if there is an earthquake, nothing will, move into the objects next to it. But there were those kind of preventative things measures taken. But the role of boxes is extremely important. And just one more point, I worked when I was younger for 6 years at the Nara National Museum. And so I was working on the catalogs for the Shosoin exhibition every year. And the Shosoin, actually, I remember an incident where there was an article about boxes in the Shosoin. And the boxes that were used for like a particular implement that was in the Shosoin was perfectly carved. It was a wooden box, but it had a perfectly carved out to hold the implement. So it was like perfectly housed inside this box. And you think that this knowledge about boxes being perfectly custom made for the object is something that's been around for 1,250 years or more. So this is something like deeply ingrained. This importance of boxes has been around for a long time.
So that's actually a good point to continue with. In the morning at various occasions, and already in this discussion about display and just now in storage, we've heard about the way in which traditional uses and ways of preserving objects persisted into the museum life of the objects. And I'm wondering if we could turn it around and say what the implications for conservation in museums have been because of this persistence of the traditional into the modern museum institution.
その先ほど来申し上げてますように、非常に度重なるじゃない、回数の多い展示会というのが我が国の文化財の展示の仕方の特徴であると申し上げております。これは短期間の展示と長期に及ぶ収蔵ということを結果として生み出すということになります。それが、それぞれの環境において安定した環境が保たれている限りは作品の損傷劣化っていうのは小さくなるということを意味するわけですね。
So as you was said earlier, that there are many rotations that take place in a museum, even for cultural properties. And so sorry, I didn't actually catch the last part of that. Melissa, did you? Oh, okay. So I'll catch up in a moment. So so that's the fundamental conundrum of conservation in the museum, is that it's perpetuating the practices of pre-modern display, but the conservation consequences that accrue from this are greater.
で対照的に今の話とは対照的に屋外にある木造建造物を想像していただけると分かると思いますけども、屋外にある木造建造物は雨風太陽そういったものにさらされるわけですから、当然修理というものをある定期的な感覚を持って行う必要が生じてくるっていうのは 多分理解していただけると思います。
But this contrasts with the situation of architecture. So think about architecture outside, exposed to the elements, in which it really requires regular, in a true sense, conservation, restoration of the building.
一方、話をその屋内のその展示会を頻繁に行うオブジェクトの方にもう一度戻ります。日本ではそういった短い展示と長い収蔵っていうことの繰り返しにもかかわらず、例えば掛け軸は100年ごとにほぼ100年ごとに修理の必要があるというふうに、キュレーター、学芸員、あるいは研究者、あるいは修理技術者、多くの人がそのように今も言っていますし、昔からそのように述べてきています。安定した環境の中に短い展示、長期の収蔵、安定した環境の中に保管されるにもかかわらず、なぜ100年ごとに確実に修理をしなければいけないか、何が原因なのか、そのことについて明確な、発言というか答えというか、そういうものはあまり聞いたことが私もありません。で、今回のこのシンポジウムで私はそこのところを考えた。答えは明確です。簡単です。繰り返されるハンドリング。これが作品を、100年ごとに予測を持って100年後に修理をする必要のある状態にしてしまうと、言い方がちょっと難しいんですけども、そういうことになるのではないかなというふうに思います。
So returning to paintings inside a museum, they lead lives which are simply a kind of a circuit of short durations of display followed by long durations of storage. This happens over and over and over. Now, it's common wisdom in the conservation world to say that a work will need to undergo conservation every 100 years. This is often said. But Dr. Kamba asked the question, why? What is the reason if in a stable environment works are displayed for short periods and then stored for long periods, would they need to be conserved every 100 years? And there's actually no really clear answer encoded anywhere to this question. And he thought a lot about this, and specifically for this symposium, he feels that the answer lies in the question of handling. Over 100 years, this cycle of short display, long storage requires so much handling that is actually, ironically, what necessitates the 100-year cycle of conservation itself.
だからといってそのハンドリング、この展示会をする習慣を非難するというものではありません。その展示会、そして100年、ほぼ100年ごとの修理との今度の組み合わせによって、日本の作品は長く保たれてきているっていう側面を私たちは忘れてはいけない。ただ、できるだけその100年というサイクルは、その現代の保存の立場としては、100年で満足することなく、できれば200年後に修理をできる、もっとその修理の間隔を伸ばしていくっていう、その方法を私たちは見つけていかなければならないというふうに感じています。
So this is not a critique of the system. It's simply the way it is. It's a combination of lots of handling plus a cycle of 100-year restorations. But we need to think about how then to extend that interval or that cycle going forward.
Yeah, so just my personal sort of sense of the conservation in Japan historically is that so much of it was done for use because the object needed to be used, they would be conserved. So paintings needed to be put out at regular, once a year, for example, or they needed to be ready, so they would be remounted or repaired as necessary. And other objects that were needed. In fact, there's, most of you know, there's a term in Japanese called dogu, which means sort of tools, implements, and paintings or, lacquers, ceramics. All of these are considered implements. They're for use for, display. That they're implements you used for the interior decor of your space at particular times. And when things are not in use, my sense, and I think we got maybe a sense of that from Dr. Oku's paper as well, is that things are left as they are. Things are not touched when they don't need to be used. So for example, I work in textiles a lot, but kimono, kosode that are going to be used, you may see them relined, reconfigured in terms of their length or their width or their sleeve length or things like that. You'll find that, but it's generally not to preserve them as historical textiles. It's because a new owner wanted to wear them. So that's for use. In contrast, Buddhist robes that are preserved for historical purposes, you find typically just folded up and put in a box and left there and sort of not touched and rarely brought out. They're preserved. There's a sort of preservation. So conservation is, preservation doesn't always mean, conserving or touching something. It can be just keeping it safely in its, box or its, chest, or, generally in a place like a kura is one thing. Yeah, and in museums, again, the systems are different in both museums. As I say, like, for example, our museum doesn't have conservators on the staff. So it's, this is, the system itself is, uses fewer remedial treatments of the type that you would typically see in Western museums where there are conservators on the staff. The Tokyo National Museum may be a different situation, but so objects may not be as in pristine condition when they go on view in every case. On the other hand, there's also government money and other funding for full remountings and things. So some very important objects are very beautiful, but it's a very different system between the two countries.
So, so I think we've run a little bit long, and I want to leave time both for lunch and for questions. So I think now we can pause and take some questions from the floor. Please.
Great question. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. Have you seen a lot of Japanese objects damaged by this off-gassing? That's number one. And secondly, which study would you guide us to that justifies the rotation schedule for the diverse objects?
オフガスのことからまずいくつか私経験がありますけども、限られた時間なので、先ほど私は日本人には木材を有効に活用する知識と経験を持つ伝統があると申し上げましたけど、実は私が東京国立博物館にいる間に その経験が十分に生かされないまま、オフガスをしつつある木材が、収蔵庫の中に入ってきて、そのことによって収蔵庫の中がそのオフガスで充満してしまって、しまったことがあります。それはその十分にからしをしなかったっていうシーズニングをしなかったということが原因です。すぐにその収蔵庫の中の作品をすべてその収蔵庫から取り出して別のところに置いて、さらにそこに設置したその新しいキャビネットの話なんですけれども、そのキャビネットから出てオフガスが出てたわけですが、そのキャビネットをすぐに解体して、1年間、別のところでキャビネットの形でシーズニングを行ったっていう経験があります。
Even though Dr. Kamba just got through saying that there is a wisdom to the use of wood traditionally in Japan, there are examples, and in the Tokyo National Museum, there's one example of a cabinet that was introduced into the storehouse that introduced deleterious gases to the objects, and that really filled up the storehouse. So it was the result of not enough seasoning of the wood, so it was immediately dismantled. But there are cases like that in his experience.
それからその展示期間、各作品ごとの分野ごとの展示期間については、ICOM からのレコメンデーション、あるいは、そうですね、ギャリー・トムソンっていう研究者からのレコメンデーションとか、あるいは東京国立博物館のガイドラインとかさまざまありますので、必要でしたらご紹介いたします。今何て言いましたっけ
in relation to the second question, you said that there are various guidelines. So the recommendations of ICOM, the International Congress of Museums, the author Gary Thompson, Tokyo National Museum has its own guidelines for the policies. Yeah. And I just mentioned that because it's such an opportunity, actually, Dr. Kamba has a book, very well-known book in Japanese in 2014 on precisely this question, on the question of conservation in a museum, which was just published in English in, I think, February or March of this year under his name. So I asked him what the title was, and he said he had forgotten. But yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about in the museums, I think they have relationship with temples and look after temple shrines and things like that. So whereas in a museum, I would suggest that curators are sort of consulted. What happens when they go to a temple? Who are the stakeholders there with whom conversation is happening?
So the question was the relationship between museums and temples. And I'm answering first because I work at the Kyoto National Museum, which probably has the closest relationship, well, the Nara National Museum as well, but these museums in old capitals have very close relationships with the temples because there are many, many old temples in the area and many cultural properties, a lot of cultural heritage in that region. And as my colleague, Mr. Mori, described, the works at our museum, almost 50% at this point, and it used to be a lot more than that, are owned by temples and shrines and are kept, entrusted to the museum on long-term loan. And so the works inside the museum are, once they're inside the museum has the ability to display them in exhibitions and things, of course, with the permission of the temples. But objects that are owned by temples that are in the temples, even if they're designated as important cultural properties or national treasures, for example, the temple has a lot of sort of leeway to do with the objects as they will. That's it's not, as my understanding is that these are there are guidelines. For example, the Agency for Cultural Affairs asked that, for example, paintings be put out only up to 4 weeks a year maximum. But I don't believe that within the temple, any exhibition within the temple counts towards that necessarily. So it's, there is a lot of sort of authority given to the, authority is, it's not the right word, but discrepancy given to the owners, not discrepancy, discretion. Thank you. I'm sorry, my English is not coming out. Discretion giving to the owners of the works. When they're once they come to the museum on loan, then the guidelines are strictly followed.
少し私付け足しますと、寺での収蔵が困難といいますか、より公開をしたい、多くの方々に見てもらいたいということと、寺での収蔵よりも博物館での収蔵の方が安全だということで、特に京都、奈良の博物館、国立博物館では多くの文化財を、自社から預かっているわけですね。しかし最近の、状況として、その預けていたお寺あるいは神社それぞれが少しずつ、新しいその展示施設を自ら持つようになりまして、いわゆる宗教的空間に、置いておくという形ではなくて、お寺そのものが展示空間を持ち、安定した保存環境、そしてセキュリティのしっかりとした展示空間にその作品を、作品じゃない、アイコンであったり、そういったものを展示するという、したがって博物館からまた元の所蔵者であるお寺に作品が戻っていくっていう現象も最近はあります。
Just to add on, so there are many works from temples and shrines stored in museums under the custodianships of museums. But little by little, in recent years, many religious institutions have created their own display spaces, gallery halls, not to display works in a religious context, but to have actual museums or treasure halls on site. And so there is a phenomenon of them kind of slowly taking back works that historically, at least in the 19th century, were given to the national museums for care and custodianship.
And with that, I think, though there are more thoughts we'll have and more words to share, we are out of time. So I want to thank our panelists and our erstwhile simultaneous translator for their work now, and we will resume at 2 p.m. in this same space. Thank you all very much.